Hey MedSurg students, in this presentation I'm going to review the anatomy and physiology of the endocrine system, which will help you when you're learning about endocrine conditions in this class. So with the endocrine system, you already know this, it's a network of glands and organs. And the endocrine system, it works very closely with the neurological system, and it's the major regulatory system of the human body. So glands communicate with the body through the secretion of hormones. And through this secretion of hormones, the endocrine system is involved in metabolism, growth, our response to stress, and it's always trying to maintain homeostasis through a negative feedback loop. That's one way the body, the endocrine system, tries to keep homeostasis. So if an endocrine gland senses there's too much of a hormone in the body, it will decrease production of that hormone. And if there's not enough, the body will increase the production of that hormone. So it's the body's attempt to maintain homeostasis. For the purposes of your lectures in the endocrine system, we are only going to be talking about primary disorders. In other words, there's a problem with the target gland, like for example, in thyroid disease, there's a problem with the thyroid gland, okay? Because there are other conditions, secondary and tertiary, that we're not going to talk about. But this is what you need as an entry-level nurse, just to know the primary conditions. The hypothalamus produces several releasing and inhibiting hormones, which influence the pituitary gland to release or suppress other hormones. So the ones that the hormones we're going to be focused on is growth hormone releasing hormone, and that stimulates the pituitary gland to release growth hormone. Then we have thyrotropin releasing hormone, and that triggers the pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone by the pituitary. And then we have corticotropic releasing hormone, and that induces the pituitary gland to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormones, ACTH. And then finally, vasopressin, which is also called antidiuretic hormone. Okay, this regulates water balance and blood pressure, and it's made in the hypothalamus. However, it is secreted by the posterior pituitary. The other hormones I was talking about are released from the anterior pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is often called the master gland of the body. It is divided into the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. What is unique about the posterior pituitary is that the hormones are manufactured in the hypothalamus, and then they travel down the pituitary stalk to the posterior pituitary, and there's two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary, and that's oxytocin, which we're not going to talk about because you'll learn about that in Mother Baby, but also ADH, which is also called vasopressin. We're going to talk about that a lot this semester. And then the other hormones are released from the anterior pituitary. As you look at this diagram, the hormones in the color blue are secreted from the posterior pituitary gland, and the color purple hormones are released from the anterior pituitary gland. So growth hormone, let's start with that. It stimulates growth, especially as we're growing in childhood, and also plays a role in maintaining healthy muscle and bone mass in adults. ACTH stimulates the adrenal glands to produce cortisol and steroid hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce the thyroid hormones, and the thyroid gland is in charge of metabolism in our body, so it regulates metabolism. And ADH regulates water balance in the body by affecting kidney function. For example, ADH promotes water reabsorption in the distal tubule. So if you have too much ADH, you're going to have too much water inside your body. So that's just a little fun fact, but we're going to get into more depth with these hormones as we move through this lecture. So the first hormone we're going to talk about is growth hormone, which is secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. It's also called somatotropin. Do not get it confused with somatostatin, because somatostatin stops growth hormone production. Okay? So this targets most of the tissue in the body, and it stimulates growth via protein synthesis. So it influences our height. It's what causes us to grow. So in children, if they have too much growth hormone, they will develop giantism, and they'll get quite tall. For adults, since their epiphyseal plates in their long bones have already sealed, they will get a condition called acromegaly, which means they have overgrowth in a lot of tissues and organs, but not the long bones. So in other words, there's no increase in height. Instead, the bones in the hand and the feet and the face become bigger. So the thyroid gland is located in the anterior neck. It's a little butterfly-shaped organ, and it is in control of metabolism in the body, okay? So if I have too much thyroid hormones, I'm going to be revved up, right? My metabolism is going to be really high. And if I have too little thyroid hormones, my metabolism is going to be really low and slow, okay? Now, on the back of the thyroid gland, there's more glands, the parathyroid glands. And you can see them, they're represented by yellow color in this picture. And they're very tiny. So oftentimes when somebody has a thyroidectomy, the parathyroid glands are inadvertently removed at the same time. The thyroid hormones are T4 and T3, okay? T3 is the active form. T4 has like an extra iodine. Not really important, but what you're going to need to know if somebody has hyperthyroidism, they're going to have too much T3 and T4. And their TSH is going to be low. That's the thyroid stimulating hormone. If it's too high, it's going to increase the metabolic rate. It helps us with growth and development. It also produces an increased catecholamine effect. So if somebody has hyperthyroidism, they're going to have tachycardia, high blood pressure, tachypnea. They're going to be like up, right? And if they have low levels, they'll be down. So they'll have bradycardia and hypotension. So thyroid is very important in our metabolism. So hypothyroidism means the hormones are too low, so they will have an increased TSH and a low T4 and T3. The thyroid gland also releases calcitonin, which helps to lower our calcium. So how I remember that is I take the L, you see I have it red here for low, and Ca, calcium. It lowers calcium, and it opposes PTH. PTH is parathyroid hormone, which is secreted by the parathyroid gland. And it causes, if there's too much parathyroid hormone, you're going to have a high calcium. Okay, so calcitonin, low calcium, and then PTH, high calcium. Okay, so calcitonin works to lower blood chemistry of calcium in our body, okay? So it inhibits the osteoclasts, which are cells that break down bone and release calcium into the bloodstream. It increases calcium excretion by the kidneys, and it slows down calcium absorption by the intestines. Thereby, it lowers calcium levels in the blood. So parathyroid hormone, or parathormone, regulates calcium and phosphorus. Remember that calcium and phosphorus live in an inverse relationship. So if calcium's up, phosphorus is going to be down. And if phosphorus is up, calcium is going to be down. With PTH, if there's a problem and it's increased, right, the PTH is increased in the body, you're going to have high calcium levels. And if it's lower, you're going to have lower calcium levels. So it's a peptide hormone, and it's responsible for regulating calcium and phosphorus in the bones and blood. So it's the main regulator of calcium, um, which we need for our bone health, our muscle function, our nerve function, and other bodily processes. So you're going to have to think back to the signs and symptoms of hypercalcemia and hypocalcemia. Okay, the next gland we're going to talk about is the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands live on top of the kidney, and they're covered with adipose tissue to protect them. The adrenal cortex is the outer layer, and that's responsible for sugar, salt, and sex hormones. So the salt hormone, the most frequent one is aldosterone. It's the one we talk about. And aldosterone sends signals to the kidneys, resulting in the kidney absorbing more sodium into the bloodstream and releasing potassium into the urine. Cortisol is the sugar hormone, and it helps control the body's use of fats, proteins, carbohydrates. It helps us suppress inflammation. It regulates our blood pressure, right? If we have too much, we're going to have an increased blood pressure, too little, low blood pressure. It increases our blood sugar, and it can also decrease bone formation. That's why patients who take corticosteroids for a long time can get osteoporosis. And it controls our sleep-wake cycle. We're not going to get into the sex hormones, the androgens, for the purpose of our endocrine lectures. And then the adrenal medulla, it secretes catecholamines. And so this is like your norepinephrine and your epinephrine, and they're very similar. They're released in response to our fight and flight response. So it's going to increase our heart rate, blood pressure, dilate our eyes, and blood flow to our skeletal muscle. And it's going to increase blood glucose so we can have the energy to fight. The pancreas has the unique distinction of being both an exocrine gland, which secretes enzymes that help us digest food, and an endocrine gland, which secretes insulin and glucagon, which are hormones. So glucagon is released when the blood sugar levels drop to help us make more glucose, and it signals the liver to convert the stored glycogen into glucose. Okay, so it breaks down fats. And then insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas, and it regulates our blood sugar, allowing glucose to enter inside the cells and let us use it for energy. So for the alpha cells, and this is in the islets of Langerhans, they release glucagon, and the beta cells release insulin. And when we talk about the GI lecture, we'll get into the exocrine function of the pancreas. Okay, that was short and sweet. Students often get turned around when we talk about endocrine disorders. So if you can remember this basic knowledge that I've brought forth in this lecture, it will help you immensely when we get into talking about the conditions, endocrine conditions. Usually they're opposing. So if one is hyper, the other is hypo, they're going to have opposite signs and symptoms. But students do get turned around when we start talking about the conditions. So write all your questions down. I'll be happy to answer them in class.